Hi. There's no one on yet, but that's okay. Where is the zipper? Hello. Much apologies for being late. I got off work later than I thought, and I had to get dinner, and it took forever. But it's me. It got delivered. It's not an ASMR podcast. I don't know why I'm whispering, but yes, I was waiting for my food to get delivered. You mean bank though, right? No. I get paid minimum wage. But I appreciate you so much, Crystal. I appreciate the dream you have for me. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to eat 2 bites of this, and then I'll read the book. So I'm going to eat this first. A little mukbang. It's not actually. I will try not to eat into my earpiece. Because I know some people don't vibe with that. But I'm going to have a bite. I don't like eating on camera. Because who does? I love that I have votes for the mukbang. I got KFC, which I never usually eat. But something about it. I was like, that is the meal for today. But yeah, that's what I'm having. Little bite of chicken to fuel me, give me protein for these chapters. Exactly. I'm gonna be honest. Chicken bowl. I knew it. No, I'm kidding. I'm gonna be honest. The second I came in from work, I did take a hit because I forgot I was supposed to do this. So if I'm a little extra silly goose tonight and I can't read very well, that's the reason why. But yeah, sorry for being late. I was just fighting for my life. Tonight we are reading chapters 14 and 15 as I sporadically eat a chicken bowl from KFC. But I won't do it while I'm reading. But you know what? That's like Colin Core. He likes to eat. That looked like I was sucking a dick. I wasn't. I'm eating chicken. Okay. I put my hair on. I put my wig on. My hood on because my hair is greasy. Oh my god, the man candle! Okay, hold on. We're going to be reading about hot men. Thus, we must light the hot man candle. And because I impulse purchased the wick cutter, we're going to trim the wick. Because apparently you're supposed to do that. The professionals know. Crystal, you got me there. You got me there, Crystal. You got me. Bath and Body Works is having a collab. Yeah, I hope they have a candle that smells like Colin. I love a man candle, but Bella VA will always have my favorite man candle. My oak moss and amber candle. Maybe I should do that. They don't sponsor me. But I love supporting a small business. We are not sponsored. But I've lit my man candle. It's a Bella VA candle. It's a local business. And it smells like a hot man. So just to recap before I start reading, I'm going to be reading, I look like a gnome. I'm going to be reading chapter 14. Let's all recall that chapter 13 was the carriage. Chapter 13 was the carriage, and it ends with Colin saying, "For God's sake, Penelope," he said, grabbing her hand and yanking her down, "are you going to marry me or not?" That was the last line of last chapter. All right. Going into chapter 14. Pardon me. the ghosts in this building don't want me to read you the porn. So, take it up with them. Oh no. Hold on. I forgot to put on my live. Okay. Okay. Chapter 14. She hit the pavement. Penelope was, in her opinion, at least, a bit more graceful than most people gave her credit for. She was a good dancer, could play the piano with her fingers arched perfectly, and could usually navigate a crowded room without bumping into an uncommon amount of people or furniture. But when Colin made his rather matter-of-fact proposal, her foot, at the time halfway out of the carriage, found only air, and her left hip found the curb, and her head found Colin's toes. "Good God, Penelope!" he exclaimed, crouching down. "Are you all right?" "Just fine," she managed to get out, searching for the hole in the ground that must have opened up so that she could crawl into it and die. "Are you certain?" "It's nothing, really," she replied, holding her cheek, which she was certain now sported a perfect imprint of the toe of Colin's boot. "Just a bit surprised, that's all." "Why?" "Why?" she echoed. "Yes, why?" She blinked. Once, twice, then again. Well, it might have to do with your mentioning marriage." He yanked her unceremoniously to her feet, nearly just dislocating her shoulder in the process. "Well, what did you think I would say?" She stared at him in disbelief. Was he mad? "Not that," she finally replied. "I'm not a complete bore," he muttered. She brushed dust and pebbles off her sleeve. "I never said you were, I can assure you," he continued, now looking mortally offended, "that I do not behave as I did with a woman of your background without rendering a marriage proposal." Penelope's mouth fell open, leaving her feeling rather like an owl. "Don't you have a reply?" he demanded. "I'm still trying to figure out what you said," she admitted. He planted his hands on his hips and stared at her with a decided lack of indulgence. "You must admit," she said, her chin dipping until she was regarding him rather dubiously through her lashes. "It did sound rather like you were, how did you say it, rendered marriage proposals before?" He scowled at her. "Of course I haven't. Now take my arm before it starts to rain." She looked up at the clear blue sky. "At the rate you're going," he said impatiently, "we'll be out here for days." I, well, she cleared her throat. "Surely you can forgive my lack of composure in the face of such tremendous surprise." "Now who's speaking in circles?" he muttered. "I beg your pardon?" His hand tightened on her arm. "Let's just get going." "Colin!" she nearly shrieked, tripping over her feet as she stumbled up the stairs. "Are you sure?" "No time like the present," he said almost jauntily. He seemed quite pleased with himself, which puzzled her, because she would have bet her entire fortune, and as Lady Whistledown she'd amassed quite a fortune, that he had not intended to ask her to marry him until the moment his carriage had ground to a halt in front of her house. Perhaps not even until the words had left his lips. He turned to her. "Do I need to knock?" "No, He knocked anyway, or rather banged, if one wanted to be particular about it. "Brierly?" Penelope said through an attempted smile as the butler opened the door to receive them. "Miss Penelope?" he murmured, one brow rising in surprise. He nodded at Colin. "Mr Bridgerton?" "Is Mrs Featherington at home?" Colin asked brusquely. "Yes, but—" "Excellent!" Colin barged in, pulling Penelope along with him. "Where is she?" "In the drawing-room, but I should tell you—" But Colin was already halfway down the hall, Penelope one step behind him. Not that she could be anywhere else, seeing as how his hand was wrapped rather tightly around her upper arm. Okay, see, I'm gonna pause. I don't love that he keeps grabbing her arm. Not the last time he does it in this book, so let's make a note. Hi, Erin. Okay, sorry. Make a note of the arm grabbing. Let's just think on it. "Mr. Bridgerton!" the butler called out, sounding slightly panicked. Penelope twisted, even as her feet continued to follow Colin. Brierly never panicked. About anything. If he didn't think she and Colin ought to enter the drawing-room, he had a very good reason. Maybe even. Oh no. Penelope dug in her heels, skidding along the hardwood floor as Colin dragged her along by the arm. Colin? She said, gulping the first syllable. Colin! What? He asked, not breaking his stride. I really think. Ah! Her skidding heels hit the edge of the runner carpet, sending her flying forward. He caught her neatly and set her on her feet. What is it? She glanced nervously at the door to the drawing room. It was slightly ajar, but maybe there was enough noise inside so that her mother hadn't yet heard them approaching. Penelope? Colin prompted impatiently. There was still time to escape, wasn't there? She looked frantically about. Not that she was likely to find a solution to her problems anywhere in the hall. Penelope, Colin said, now tapping his foot, what the devil is the matter? She looked back to Brierly, who simply shrugged his shoulders. This really might not be the best time to speak to my mother. He raised one brow, looking rather like the butler had just seconds earlier. You're not planning to refuse me, are you? No, of course not, she said hastily, even though she hadn't truly accepted the fact that he even intended to offer for her. Then this is an excellent time, he stated, his tone inviting no further protest. But it's... What? Tuesday, she thought miserably. And it was just past noon, which meant... Let's go, Colin said, striding forward. Before she could stop him, he pushed open the door. Colin's first thought upon stepping into the drawing room was that the day, while certainly not proceeding in any manner he might have anticipated when he'd risen from bed that morning, was turning out to be the most excellent endeavor. Marriage to Penelope was an eminently sensible idea, and surprisingly appealing as well, if their recent encounter in the carriage was any indication. Thinking with his dick. His second thought was that he just entered his worst nightmare, because Penelope's mother was not alone in the drawing room. Every last Featherington, current and former, was there, along with assorted spouses and even a cat. Because Penelope's mother... Oh, Mark. It was the most frightening assemblage of people Colin had ever witnessed. Penelope's family was, well, except for Felicity, whom he'd always held in some suspicion. How could one truly trust anyone that was such good friends with Hyacinth? Her family was, well, he couldn't think of a good word for it. Certainly nothing complimentary, although he'd like to think he could have avoided an outright insult. And really, was there a word that effectively combined slightly dim, overly talkative, rather meddlesome, excruciatingly dull, and one couldn't forget this, not with Robert Huxley, a recent addition to the clan, uncommonly loud. So Colin just smiled, his great big, friendly, slightly mischievous smile. It almost always worked, and today was no exception. The Featheringtons all smiled right back at him, and, thank God, said nothing. At least not right away. Colin, Mrs. Featherington said with visible surprise, how nice of you to bring Penelope home for our family meeting. Your family meeting, he echoed. He looked to Penelope, who was standing next to him, looking rather ill. Every Tuesday, she said, smiling weakly. Didn't I mention it? Oh, wait, that's Penelope. Every Tuesday, she said, smiling weakly. Didn't I mention it? No, he replied, even though it was obvious her question had been for the benefit of their audience. No, you didn't mention it. Bridgerton! Bellowed Robert Huxley, who was married to Penelope's eldest sister Prudence. Huxley! Colin returned, taking a discreet step back, best to protect his eardrums in case Penelope's brother-in-law decided to leave his post near the window. Thankfully, Huxley stayed put, but Penelope's other brother-in-law, the well-meaning but vacant-minded Nigel Burbrook, did cross the room, greeting Colin with a hearty slap on the back. Wasn't expecting you, Burbrook said jovially. No, Colin murmured. I wouldn't think so. Just family, after all, Burbrook said. And you're not family. Not my family, at least. Not yet, anyway, Colin murmured, stealing a glance at Penelope. She was blushing. Then he looked back at Mrs. Featherington, who was looking as if she might faint from excitement. Colin groaned through his smile. He hadn't meant for her to hear his comment about possibly joining the family. For some reason, he'd wanted to retain an element of surprise before he asked for Penelope's hand. If Portia Featherington knew his intentions ahead of time, she'd likely twist the whole thing around and, in her mind at least, so that she had somehow orchestrated the match herself. And for some reason, Colin found that exceedingly distasteful. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said to Mrs. Featherington. "No, of course not," she said quickly. "We're delighted to have you here at a family gathering." But she looked rather odd, not precisely undecided about his presence there, but certainly unsure of what her next move should be. Yeah. She was chewing on her lower lip, and then she darted a furtive glance at Felicity of all people. Colin turned to Felicity. She was looking at Penelope, a small secret smile fixed on her face. Penelope was glaring at her mother, her mouth twisted into an irritated grimace. Colin's gaze went from Featherington to Featherington to Featherington. Something was clearly simmering under the surface here, and if he weren't trying to figure out A, how to avoid being trapped into conversation with Penelope's relations, while B, somehow managing to issue a proposal of marriage at the same time, well, he'd be rather curious as to what was causing all the secrets. Underhanded glances being tossed back and forth between the Featherington women. Mrs. Featherington cast one last glance at Felicity, did a little gesture that Colin could have sworn meant sit up straight, then fixed her attention on Colin. "Won't you sit down?" she asked, smiling widely and patting the seat next to her on the sofa. "Of course," he murmured, because there was really no getting out of it now. He still had to ask for Penelope's hand in marriage, and even if he didn't particularly want to do it in front of every last Featherington and their two inane spouses, he was stuck here, at least until a polite opportunity to make his escape presented itself. He turned and offered his arm to the woman he intended to make his bride. "Penelope?" Yes, of course," she stammered, placing her hand at the crook of his elbow. "Oh, yes," Miss Featherington said, as if she'd completely forgotten about her daughter's presence. "Terribly sorry, Penelope. Didn't see you. Would you please go and ask cook to increase our order? We'll surely need more food if Mr. Bridgerton is here." "Of course," Penelope said, the corners of her lips quivering. "Can't she ring for it?" Colin asked loudly. "What?" Miss Featherington said distractedly. "Well, I suppose she could, but wouldn't it take longer? And Penelope doesn't mind, do you?" Penelope gave her head a little shake. "I mind," Colin said. Mrs. Featherington let out a little "oh" of surprise, then said, "Very well. Penelope, why don't you sit right there?" She motioned to a chair that was not quite situated to be a part of the inner conversation circle. Felicity, who was seated directly across from her mother, jumped up. "Penelope, take my seat." "No," Miss Featherington said firmly. "You have been feeling under the weather, Felicity. You need to sit." Colin thought Felicity looked the picture of health, but she sat back down. "Penelope," Prudence said loudly from over by the window, "I need to speak with you." Penelope glanced helplessly from Colin to Prudence to Felicity to her mother. Colin yanked her in closer. "I need to speak with her as well," he said smoothly. Right, well, I suppose there's room for both of you," Miss Featherington said, scooting over on the sofa. Colin was caught between the good manners that had been drummed into his head since birth and the overwhelming urge to strangle the woman who would someday be his mother-in-law. He had no idea why she was treating Penelope like some sort of lesser-favored stepchild, but really, it had to stop. "What brings you this way?" yelled Robert Huxley. Colin touched his ears. He couldn't help himself. Then said, "Oh, goodness," fluttered Mrs. Featherington. "We do not mean to interrogate our guests, do we?" Colin hadn't thought that Huxley's question constituted an interrogation, but he didn't really want to insult Mrs. Featherington by saying so. So he merely nodded and said something completely meaningless like, "Yes, well, of course." "Of course what?" asked Philippa. Philippa was married to Nigel Burbrook, and Colin had always thought it was a rather good match indeed. I'm sorry? He queried. You said, of course, Philippa said. Of course what? I don't know what these voices are. I don't know, Colin said. Oh, well, then why did you... Philippa, Mrs. Featherington said loudly. Perhaps you should fetch the food, since Penelope has forgotten to ring for it. Oh, I'm sorry, Penelope said quickly, starting to rise to her feet. Don't worry, Colin said through a smooth smile, grabbing hold of her hand and yanking her back down. Your mother said Prudence could do it. Philippa, Penelope said. What about Philippa? She said Philippa could do it, not Prudence. He wondered what had happened to his brain, because somewhere between his carriage and this sofa it had clearly disappeared. Does it matter? He asked. No, not really, but... Felicity! Mrs. Featherington interrupted. Why don't you tell Mr. Bridgerton about your watercolors? For the life of him, Colin couldn't imagine a less interesting topic, except maybe for Philippa's watercolors. But he nonetheless turned to the youngest Featherington with a friendly smile and asked, And how are your watercolors? But Felicity, bless her heart, gave him a rather friendly smile and said nothing but, I imagine they're fine, thank you. Mrs. Featherington looked as if she'd just swallowed a live eel, then exclaimed, Felicity! Yes, Felicity said sweetly. You didn't tell him you'd won an award. She turned to Colin. Felicity's watercolors are very unique. She turned back to Felicity. Do tell Mr. Bridgerton about your award. Oh, I don't imagine he is interested in that. Of course he is, Miss Featherington ground out. Normally, Colin would have chimed in with, Of course I am, since he was, after all, an exceedingly affable fellow. But doing so would have validated Mrs. Featherington's statement, and, perhaps more critically, ruined Felicity's good fun. And Felicity appeared to be having a lot of fun. Philippa, she said, weren't you going to go after the food? Oh, right, Philippa replied. Forgot all about it. I do that a lot. Come along, Nigel. You can keep me company. Righto, Nigel beamed. And he and Philippa left the room, giggling all the way. Colin reaffirmed his conviction that the Burbrook Featherington match had been a good one indeed. I think I shall go out to the garden, Prudence suddenly announced, taking hold of her husband's arm. Penelope, why don't you come with me? Penelope opened her mouth a few seconds before she figured out what to say, leaving her looking a little bit like a confused fish, but in Colin's opinion, a rather fetching fish, if such a thing were possible. Finally, her chin took on a resolute mien, and she said, I don't think so, Prudence. Penelope! Mrs. Featherington exclaimed. I need to show you something, Prudence ground out. I really think I'm needed here, Penelope replied. I can join you later this afternoon if you'd like. I need you now. Penelope looked to her sister in surprise, clearly not expecting quite so much resistance. I'm sorry, Prudence, she reiterated. I believe I'm needed here. Nonsense, Mrs. Featherington said breezily. Felicity and I can keep Mr. Bridgerton company. Felicity jumped to her feet. Oh no, she exclaimed, her eyes round and innocent. I forgot something. What? Mrs. Featherington asked between her teeth. Could you have possibly forgotten? My watercolors. She turned to Colin with a sweet, mischievous smile. You did want to see them, didn't you? Of course, he murmured, deciding he very much liked Penelope's younger sister. Seeing as how they're so unique. One might say they're uniquely ordinary, Felicity said with an overly earnest nod. Penelope, Mrs. Featherington said, obviously trying to hide her annoyance. Would you be so kind as to fetch Felicity's watercolors? Penelope doesn't know where they are, Felicity said quickly. Why don't you tell her? For God's sake, Colin finally exploded. Let Felicity go. I need a private moment with you anyway. Silence reigned. It was the first time Colin Bridgerton had ever lost his temper in public. Besides him, Colin heard Penelope let out a little gasp. But when he glanced at her, she was hiding a tiny smile behind her hand, and that made him feel ridiculously good. "A private moment," Miss Featherington echoed, her hand fluttering to her chest. She glanced over at Prudence and Robert, who were still standing by the window. They immediately left the room, although not without a fair bit of grumbling on Prudence's part. "Penelope," Mrs. Featherington said, "perhaps you should accompany Felicity." "Penelope will remain," Colin ground out. "Penelope?" Mrs. Featherington asked doubtfully. "Yes," he said slowly, in case she still didn't understand his meaning. "Penelope." "But—" Colin gave her such a glare that she actually drew back and folded her hands in her lap. "I'm gone," Felicity chirped, sailing out of the room, but before she could close the door behind her, Colin saw her give a quick wink to Penelope. And Penelope smiled, love for her younger sister shining clearly in her eyes. Colin relaxed. He hadn't realized just how tense Penelope's misery was making him. And she was definitely miserable. Good God, he couldn't wait to remove her from the bosom of her ridiculous family. Mrs. Featherington's lips spread into a feeble attempt at a smile. She looked from Colin to Penelope and back again, then finally said, "You desired a word?" "Yes," he replied, eager to get this done with. "I would be honored if you would grant me your daughter's hand in marriage." For a moment, Mrs. Featherington made no reaction. Then, her eyes grew round, her mouth grew round, her body was already round. Then she clapped her hands together, unable to say anything other than, "Oh! Oh!" And then, "Felicity! Felicity! Felicity!" Portia Featherington jumped to her feet, ran to the door, and actually screamed like a fishwife, "Felicity! Felicity!" "Oh, Mother," Penelope moaned, closing her eyes. "Why are you summoning Felicity?" Colin asked, rising to his feet. Mrs. Featherington turned to him quizzically. "Don't you want to marry Felicity?" Colin actually thought he might be sick. "No, for God's sake, I don't want to marry Felicity," he snapped. "If I'd wanted to marry Felicity, I'd hardly have sent her upstairs for her bloody watercolors, would I?" Mrs. Featherington swallowed uncomfortably. "Mr. Bridgerton," she said, wringing her hands together, "I don't understand." He stared at her in horror, which then turned to disgust. "Penelope," he said, grabbing her hand and yanking her until she was pressed close to his side, "I want to marry Penelope." "Penelope?" Mrs. Featherington echoed. But what?" he interrupted, his voice pure menace. But, it's all right, Colin," Penelope said hastily. No, it is not all right," he exploded. "I've never given any indication that I'm the least bit interested in Felicity." Felicity appeared in the doorway, clapped her hand over her mouth, and quickly disappeared, wisely shutting the door behind her. "Yes," Penelope said placatingly, shooting a quick look at her mother. "But Felicity is unmarried, and—" "So are you," he pointed out. "I know, but I'm old, and Felicity is an infant," he spat. "Good God, marrying her would be like marrying Hyacinth." "Except for the incest," Penelope said. He gave her an extremely unamused look. "Right," she said, mostly to fill the silence. "It's just a terrible misunderstanding, isn't it?" No one said anything. Penelope looked at Colin pleadingly. "Isn't it?" "It certainly is," he muttered. She turned to her mother. "Mamma?" "Penelope," she murmured, and Penelope knew that her mother wasn't asking her a question. Rather, she was still expressing her disbelief that Colin would want to marry her. And oh, but it hurts so much. You'd think that she'd be used to it by now. "I would like to marry Mr. Bridgerton," Penelope said, trying to summon up as much quiet dignity as she could manage. "He asked me, and I said yes." "Well, of course you would say yes," her mother retorted. "You'd have to be an idiot to say no." Mrs. Featherington, Colin said tightly, I suggest you begin treating my future wife with a bit more respect. Colin, it's not necessary, Penelope said, placing her hand on his arm. But the truth was, her heart was soaring. He might not love her, but he cared about her. No man could defend a woman with such fierce protectiveness without caring for her a little. It is necessary, he returned. For God's sake, Penelope, I arrived with you. I made it abundantly clear that I required your presence in the room, and I practically shoved Felicity out the door to fetch her watercolors. Why on earth would anyone think I wanted Felicity? Mrs. Featherington opened and closed her mouth several times before finally saying, I love Penelope, of course, but do you know her? Colin shot back. She's lovely and intelligent, and has a fine sense of humor. Who would not want to marry a woman like that? Penelope would have melted to the floor if she weren't already holding on to his hand. Thank you, she whispered, not caring if her mother heard her, not even really caring if Colin heard her. Somehow she needed to say the words for herself. Not what she thought she was. Lady Danbury's face swam before her eyes, her expression warm and a little bit cunning. Something more. Maybe Penelope was something more, and maybe Colin was the only other person to realize that as well. It made her love him all the more. Her mother cleared her throat, then stepped forward and gave Penelope a hug. It was, at first, a hesitant embrace on both their parts, but then Portia tightened her arms around her third-born daughter, and with a choked cry, Penelope found herself returning the hug in equal measure. I do love you, Penelope, Portia said, and I am very pleased for you. She drew back and wiped a tear from her eye. I shall be lonely without you, of course, since I'd assumed we would grow old together, but this is what's best for you, and that, I suppose, is what being a mother is all about. Penelope let out a loud sniffle, then blindly reached for Colin's handkerchief, which he had already pulled from his pocket and was holding in front of her. You'll learn some day, Portia said, patting her on the arm. She turned to Colin and said, We're delighted to welcome you to the family. He nodded, not terribly warmly, but Penelope thought he made a rather nice effort, considering how angry he'd been just moments earlier. Penelope smiled and squeezed his hand, aware that she was about to embark upon the adventure of her life. Big sleigh! Okay, that's the end of chapter 14. But do you know her? Do you know her? She is smart. That's the best line, and I'm like, I have to find it. I'll go find it and repost it or something. But there is this one like TikTok or like, oh my god, my hair is horrid. Um, Something that's like a picture of Colin and Portia, and it's like I can't wait for these two to have their bitch off. Like, and I really can't. Like, if they cut out, do you know her? Like, I'm gonna riot, and it's gonna be bad. It's gonna be bad. I'm gonna be clawing at the walls of my enclosure. But do you know her? Okay, you guys, it's time. Does anyone have thoughts on what we've just read, or should I just go to the next chapter? No thoughts. No thoughts. Me too. Haley, you're so real. Oh my god. I'm like impartial to You're My Mess. Like, when does he say that? I think he says that after they bone. Or like after a drawing room moment. He hasn't said it yet. That's all I know. So it wasn't the carriage scene. So he hits her with a You're My Mess, but I'm like, if I'm a mess and I'm trying not to get caught when I go home and you're not helping me at all, like, we have a problem. You need to be helpful. You don't need to say your little funny, like, silly goose jokes. I love Colin too. But like, if I'm actively a mess, you need to help me. I'm not walking out with some Colin love on the bosom of my dress. Like, help, help. Anyway, that's my beef with You're My Mess. Thank you, Erin. It is in the drawing room. Um, So if we don't get, do you know her over You're My Mess? Yeah. Me and Haley are going to Shondaland. Quick. With quickness and haste. Yeah, I definitely need more season 3 clip soon. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna eat one more bite of this and then. Hey, KFC kind of popped off with this one, and then I'll read the next chapter. Let's see how long it is. Oh, is this a Colin Daphne moment? Oh my god, it's You're My Mess is the next chapter. Alright, we gonna get there. I want a different proposal in the show, though. Me too. I want the love declaration to be the proposal because I've talked about it before. I think in the show, because specifically because Penn has other options, if Colin is not completely aware he's in love with her and ready to fervently, assuredly, loudly tell her he's in love with her, and still is trying to like fuck up her relationships with other people, which is an assumption and not a promise. Like, I'm gonna be mad at him. Like, he's gonna piss me off for real. I just turned on my okay. Yeah, but he's gonna piss me off for real with that. I think it'll be there because it's Nicholas Fape. I'm totally fine if it's there, but if it's there, like, I guess it wouldn't like swap out other lines. But if there's other lines that I like more that aren't there, I'm gonna be sad puppy. But like, I respect Nicola and her choices. I respect a woman's right to choose to put a line in the show. Um, Not that Nicola wrote the show, but I think she did push for that scene, it seems. Okay. I'm going to start chapter 15, which apparently is the You're My Mess chapter. So get excited. Also, you guys, I don't know. I respect Mother as well. I don't know what's going on with my voices tonight. The voices I'm giving to characters, I like can't remember what voices they had previously. So sorry, but also, we can all cope. This chapter's long. Okay. You know, Eloise said 3 days. Chapter 15. You know, Eloise said 3 days after Colin and Penelope made their surprise announcement, it really is a pity that Lady Whistledown has retired, because this would have been the coup of a decade. Certainly from Lady Whistledown's viewpoint, Penelope murmured, lifting her teacup to her lips and keeping her eyes trained on the wall clock in Lady Bridgerton's informal drawing room. Better not to look at Eloise directly. She had a way of noticing secrets in a person's eyes. It was funny. Penelope had gone years without worrying that Eloise would discover the truth about Lady Whistledown, at least not worrying overmuch. But now that Colin knew, it somehow felt as if her secret were floating about in the air, like particles of dust just waiting to form into a cloud of knowledge. Maybe the Bridgertons were like dominoes. Once one found out, it was only a matter of time before they all fell. What do you mean? Eloise asked, breaking into Penelope's nervous thoughts. If I recall correctly, Penelope said very carefully, she once wrote that she would have to retire if I ever married a Bridgerton. Eloise's eyes bugged out. She did? Or something like that, Penelope said. You're joking, Eloise said, making a sort of sound as she waved her hand dismissively. She would have never been that cruel. Penelope coughed, not really thinking that she could end the topic by faking a biscuit crumb in her throat, but trying nonetheless. No, really, Eloise persisted. What did she say? I don't recall precisely. Try. Penelope stalled by setting her cup down and reaching for another biscuit. They were all alone for tea, which was odd, but Lady Bridgerton had dragged Colin off on some errand regarding the upcoming wedding, set for only a month hence, and Felicity was off shopping with Hyacinth, who had, upon hearing Penelope's news, thrown her arms around her sister and shrieked her delight until Penelope's ears had gone numb. As far as sisterly moments went, it had been something wonderful. Well, Penelope said, chewing on a bite of biscuit, I believe she said that if I married a Bridgerton, it would be the end of the world as she knew it, and as she wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of such a world, she would have to retire immediately. Eloise stared at her for a moment. That's not a precise recollection? One doesn't forget things like that, Penelope demurred. uh, hmm. Eloise's nose wrinkled with disdain. Well, that was rather horrid of her, I must say. Now I now I doubly wish she were still writing, because she would have to eat an entire gaggle of crow. Do crows gather in gaggles? I don't know, Eloise replied promptly, but they should. You're a very good friend, Eloise, Penelope said quietly. Yes, Eloise said with an affected sigh. I know, the very best. Penelope smiled. Eloise's breezy reply made it clear that she wasn't in the mood for emotion or nostalgia, which was fine. There was a time and place for everything. Penelope had said what she wanted to say, and she knew that Eloise returned the sentiment, even if she preferred to joke and tease at the moment. I must confess, though, Eloise said, reaching for another biscuit, you and Colin did surprise me. We surprised me as well, Penelope admitted wryly. Not that I'm not delighted, Eloise hastened to add. There's no one I'd rather have as a sister. Well, aside from the ones I already have, of course. And if I'd ever dreamed the two of you were inclined in that direction, I'm sure I would have meddled horribly. I know, Penelope said, laughter forcing her lips up at the corners. Yes, well, Eloise waved the comment away. I'm not known for minding my own business. What's that on your fingers? Penelope asked, leaning forward for a better look. What, that? Oh, nothing. But she settled her hands in her lap nonetheless. It's not nothing, Penelope said. Let me see. It looks like ink. Well, of course it does. It is ink. Then why didn't you say so when I asked? Because, Eloise said pertly, it's none of your business. Penelope drew back in shock at Eloise's sharp tone. I'm terribly sorry, she said stiffly. I had no idea it was such a sensitive subject. It's not, Eloise said quickly. Don't be silly. It's just that I'm clumsy and I can't write without getting ink all over my fingers. I suppose I could wear gloves, but then they'd be covered in ink. And I'd be forever replacing them, and I can assure you that I have no wish to spend my entire allowance, meager as it is, on gloves. Penelope stared at her through her lengthy explanation. What were you writing? Nothing, Eloise said dismissively. Just letters. Penelope could tell from Eloise's brisk tone that she didn't particularly want to subject the topic to further explanation. But she was being so uncharacteristically evasive that Penelope couldn't resist asking, To whom? The letters? Yes, Penelope replied, even though she thought that was rather obvious. Oh, no one. Well, unless they're a diary, they're not to no one, Penelope said, impatience adding a short tinge to her voice. Eloise gave her a vaguely affronted look. You're rather nosy today. Well, because you're being so evasive. They're just to Francesca, Eloise said with a little snort. Well, then why didn't you say so? Eloise crossed her arms. Perhaps I didn't appreciate your questioning me. Penelope's mouth fell open. She couldn't remember the last time she and Eloise had anything even remotely approaching a row. Eloise, she said, her shock showing her voice. What is wrong? Nothing is wrong. I know that's not true. Eloise said nothing, just pursed her lips and glanced toward the window, a clear attempt to end the conversation. Are you angry with me? Penelope persisted. Why would I be angry with you? I don't know, but it's clear that you are. Eloise let out a little sigh. I'm not angry. Well, you're something. I'm just, I'm just, she shook her head. I don't know what I am. Restless, I suppose. Out of sorts. Penelope was silent as she digested that, then said quietly, Is there anything I can do? No. She doesn't say it like that. No, Eloise smiled wryly. If there were, you can be sure I'd have already asked it of you. Penelope felt something that was almost a laugh rising within her. She liked how how like Eloise to make such a comment. I suppose it's Eloise began, her chin lifting in thought. No, never mind. No, Penelope said, reaching out and taking her friend's hand. Tell me. Eloise pulled her hand free and looked away. You'll think I'm silly. Maybe, Penelope said with a smile. But you'll still be my very closest friend. Oh, Penelope, but I'm not, Eloise said sadly. I'm not worthy of it. Eloise, don't talk such madness. I'd have gone right out insane trying to navigate London and society and the town without you. Eloise smiled. We did have fun, didn't we? Well, yes, when I was with you, Penelope admitted. The rest of the time I was bloody miserable. Penelope! I don't believe I've ever heard you curse before. Penelope gave her a sheepish smile. It slipped out. And besides, I couldn't possibly think of a better adjective to describe the life of a wallflower among the ton. Eloise let out an unexpected chuckle. Now that's a book I would like to read. A Wallflower Among the Ton. Not unless you're given to tragedies. Oh, come on now, it couldn't be a tragedy. It would have to be a romance. You're getting your happy ending after all. Penelope smiled. As strange as it was, she was getting a happy ending. Colin had been a lovely and attentive fiancé, at least for the 3 days that he'd been playing the role, and it couldn't have been particularly easy. They'd been subjected to more speculation and scrutiny than Penelope could have imagined. She wasn't surprised, though, when she, as Lady Whistledown, had written that the world would end as she knew it if a Featherington married a Bridgerton. She'd rather thought she'd been echoing a prevalent sentiment. To say that the Ton had been shocked by Penelope's engagement would have been an understatement indeed. As much as Penelope liked to anticipate and reflect upon her upcoming marriage, she was still a bit disturbed about Eloise's strange mood. Eloise, she said seriously, I want you to tell me what has you so upset. Eloise sighed. I'd hoped you'd forgotten about it. I've learned tenacity from the master, Penelope commented. That made Eloise smile, but only for a moment. I feel so disloyal, she said. What have you done? Oh, nothing. She patted her heart. It's all inside. She stopped, looking to the side, her eyes settling on the fringed corner of the carpet. But Penelope suspected that she didn't see much of anything, at least nothing beyond what was rumbling about in her mind. I'm so happy for you, Eloise said, the words tumbling forth in odd bursts, punctuated by awkward pauses. And I honestly think I can really, truly say that I'm not jealous. But at the same time, Penelope waited for Eloise to collect her thoughts. Or maybe she was collecting her courage. At the same time, she said, so softly that Penelope could barely hear her, I suppose I always thought you'd be a spinster right along with me. I've chosen this life, I know that. I know that I have. I could have married. I know, Penelope said quietly. But I never did because it never seemed right, and I didn't want to settle for anything less than what my brothers and sister have, and now Colin too, she said, motioning toward Penelope. Penelope didn't mention that Colin had never said he loved her. It didn't seem like the right time, or frankly the sort of thing she cared to share. Besides, even if he didn't love her, she still thought he cared about her, and that was enough. I would never have wanted you to not marry, Eloise explained. I just never thought you would. She closed her eyes, looking quite agonized. That came out all wrong. I've insulted you terribly. No, you haven't, Penelope said, meaning it. I never thought I would marry either. Eloise nodded sadly. And somehow it made it all right. I was almost 28 and unmarried, and you were already 28 and unmarried, and we'd always have each other. But now you have Colin. I still have you too. At least I hope I do. Of course you do, Eloise said fervently. But it won't be the same. You must cleave unto your husband, or at least that's what they all say, she added with a slightly mischievous spark in her eyes. Colin will come first, and that's how it should be. And frankly, she added, her smile growing a bit sly, I'd have to kill you if he didn't. He's my favorite brother after all. It really wouldn't do for him to have a disloyal wife. Penelope laughed out loud at that. Do you hate me? Eloise asked. Penelope shook her head. No, she said softly. If anything, I love you all the more, because I know how difficult it must have been to be honest with me about this. So glad you said that, Eloise said with a loud, dramatic sigh. I was terrified that you'd say that the only solution would be for me to find a husband as well. The thought had crossed Penelope's mind, but she shook her head and said, Of course not. Good, because my mother has been saying it constantly. Penelope smiled wryly. I'd be surprised if she hadn't. Good afternoon, ladies. The two women looked up to see Colin entering the room. Penelope's heart did a little flip upon seeing him, and she found herself oddly out of breath. Her heart had been doing little flips for years whenever he walked into a room, but it was somehow different now, more intense. Perhaps because she knew what it was like to be with him and to be wanted by him, to know what he would be, to know that he would be her husband. Her heart flipped again. Colin let out a loud groan. You ate all the food. There was only one small plate of biscuits, Eloise said in their defense. That's not what I was led to believe, Colin grumbled. Penelope and Eloise shared a glance, then both burst out laughing. What? Colin demanded, leaning down to press a quick, dutiful kiss on Penelope's cheek. You sounded so sinister, Eloise explained. It's just food. It's never just food, Colin said, plopping down in the chair. Penelope was still wondering when her cheek would stop tingling. So, he said, taking a half-eaten biscuit off of Eloise's plate. What were you two talking about? Lady Whistledown, Eloise said promptly. Penelope choked on her tea. Were you? Colin said softly, but Penelope detected a definite edge in his voice. Yes, Eloise said. I was telling Penelope that it's really too bad she's retired, since your engagement would have been quite the most newsworthy piece of gossip we've had all year. Interesting how that works, Colin murmured. Eloise agreed. And she surely would have devoted an entire column just to your engagement ball tomorrow night. Penelope did not lower her teacup from her mouth. Do you want some more? Eloise asked her. Penelope nodded and handed her the cup, although she very much missed having it in front of her face as a shield. She knew that Eloise had blurted out Lady Whistledown's name because she did not want Colin to know she had mixed feelings about his marriage. But still, Penelope fervently wished that Eloise had said anything else in reply to Colin's question. Why don't you ring for more food? Eloise asked Colin. Already did so, he answered. Wickham intercepted me in the hall and asked if I was hungry. He popped the last bite of Eloise's biscuit into his mouth. Wise man, that Wickham. Where did you go today, Colin? Penelope asked, eager to get the topic firmly off Lady Whistledown. He gave his head a beleaguered shake. Devil if I know. Mother dragged me from shop to shop. Aren't you 33 years old? Eloise inquired sweetly. He answered her with a scowl. Just thought you'd be beyond the age of having Mother drag you around, that's all, she murmured. Mother will be dragging all of us around when we're doddering old fools, and you know it, he replied. Besides, she's so delighted to see me married, I can't really bring myself to spoil her fun. Penelope sighed. This had been why she loved the man. Anyone who treated his mother so well would surely be an excellent husband. And how are your wedding preparations coming along? Colin asked. She hadn't meant to pull a face, but she did anyways. I have never been so exhausted in all my life, she admitted. He reached over and grabbed a large crumb off her plate. We should elope. Oh, could we really? Penelope asked, the words flying from her lips in an unsummoned rush. He blinked. Actually, I was joking, mostly, although it does seem a prime idea. I shall arrange for a ladder, Eloise said, clapping her hands together, so you might climb to her room and steal her away. There's a tree, Penelope said. Colin will have no difficulty with it. Good God, he said. You're not serious, are you? No, she sighed. But I could be if you were. I can't be. Do you know what it would do to my mother? He rolled his eyes. Not to mention yours. Penelope groaned. I know. She'd hunt me down and try and kill me, Colin said. Mine or yours? Both. They'd join forces. He craned his neck towards the door. Where is the food? You just got here, Colin, Eloise said. Give them time. And here I thought Wickham was a sorcerer, he grumbled, able to conjure food with a snap of his hand. Here you are, sir, came Wickham's voice as he sailed into the room with a large tray. See? Colin said, raising his brows first to Eloise, then at Penelope. I told you so. Why, Penelope asked, do I sense that I will be hearing those words from your lips far too many times in my future? Most likely because you will, Colin replied. You'll soon learn, he shot her an extremely cheeky grin, that I am almost always right. Oh, please, Eloise groaned. I may have to side with Eloise on this one, Penelope said. Against your husband, he placed a hand on his heart, while the other one reached for a sandwich. I'm wounded. You're not my husband yet. Colin turned to Eloise. The kitten has claws. Eloise raised her brows. You didn't realize that before you proposed? Of course I did, he said, taking a bite of his sandwich. I just didn't think she'd use them on me. And then he looked at her with a hot, masterful expression that Penelope... And then he looked at her with such a hot, masterful expression that Penelope's bones went straight to water. Well, Eloise announced, rising quite suddenly to her feet, I think I shall allow you two soon-to-be newlyweds a moment or two of privacy. How positively forward-thinking of you, Colin murmured. Eloise looked at him with a peevish twist of her mouth. Anything for you, dear brother, or rather, she added, her expression growing arch, anything for Penelope. Colin stood and turned to his betrothed. I seem to be slipping down the pecking order. Penelope just smiled behind her teacup and said, I am making it my policy never to get in the middle of a Bridgerton spat. Oh, Eloise chortled. You'll not be able to keep to that one, I'm afraid, Mrs. Soon-to-be Bridgerton. Besides, she added with a wicked grin, if you think this is a spat, I can't wait until you see us in full form. You mean I haven't? Penelope asked. Both Eloise and Colin shook their heads in a way that made her extremely fearful. Oh, dear. Is there something I should know? Penelope asked. Colin grinned rather wolfishly. It's too late now. Penelope gave Eloise a helpless glance, but all she did was laugh as she left the room, closing the door firmly behind her. Now that was nice of Eloise, Colin murmured. What? Penelope asked innocently. His eyes gleamed. The door. The door? Oh, she yelped. The door. Colin smiled, moving over to the sofa beside her. There was something rather delightful about Penelope on a rainy afternoon. He'd hardly seen her since they'd become engaged. Wedding plans had a way of doing that to a couple, and yet she'd not been out of his thoughts, even as he slept. Funny how that happened. He'd spent years not really ever thinking about her unless she was standing in front of his face, and now she permeated his every last thought, his every last desire. How had this happened? When had this happened? And did it really matter? Maybe the only important thing was that he wanted her, and she was, or at least she would be, his. Once he put his ring on her finger, the hows and whys and whens would become irrelevant, provided that this madness he felt never went away. He touched his finger to her chin, tipping her face up to the light. Her eyes shone with anticipation, and her lips. Dear God, how was it possible that the men of London had never noticed how perfect they were? He smiled. This was a permanent madness, and he couldn't have been more pleased. Colin had never been opposed to marriage. He'd simply been opposed to a dull marriage. He wasn't picky. He just wanted passion and friendship and intellectual conversation, and a good laugh every now and then. A wife from whom he wouldn't want to stray. Amazingly, he seemed to have found that in Penelope. All he needed to do now was make sure her big secret remained that, a secret. He didn't think he could bear the pain he'd see in her eyes if she were cast out of society. "Colin," she whispered, her breath quivering across her lips, making him really want to kiss her. He leaned in. "Hmm? You were so quiet." "Just thinking." "About what?" He gave her an indulgent smile. "You really have been spending too much time with my sister." "What does that mean?" she asked, her lips twitching in such a way that he knew she'd never feel any compunction at poking fun at him. She would keep him on his toes, this woman. "You seem," he said, "to have developed a certain penchant for persistence." "Tenacity?" "That too. But that's a good thing." Their lips were still mere inches apart, but the urge to continue the teasing conversation was too strong. "When you're persistently avowing your obedience to your husband," he murmured, "that's a good thing." "Oh, really?" His chin dipped into the barest hint of a nod. "And when you're tenaciously holding onto my shoulders when I'm kissing you, that's a good thing as well." Her dark eyes widened so delightfully that he had to add, "Don't you think?" And then she surprised him. "Like this?" she asked, placing her hands on his shoulders. Her tone was daring, her eyes pure flirtation. God, he loved that she'd surprised him. "That's a start," he said. "You might have to—" He moved one of his hands to cover hers, pressing her fingers into his skin. "Hold me a little more tenaciously." "I see," she murmured. "So what you're saying is that I should never let go?" He thought about it for a moment. "Yes," he answered, realizing that there was a deeper meaning in her words, whether she'd intended it or not. "That's exactly what I'm saying." Then words were simply not enough. He brought his lips to hers, remaining gentle for barely a second before his hunger overtook him. He kissed her with a passion that he hadn't ever known he possessed. It wasn't about desire, or at least it wasn't just about desire. It was about need, and about a strange sensation, hot and fierce inside of him, urging him to lay claim to her, to somehow brand her as his. He wanted her desperately, and he had absolutely no idea how he could possibly make it through an entire month before the wedding. "Colin?" Penelope gasped, just as he was easing her down back onto her back on the sofa. He was kissing her jaw, then her neck, and his lips were far too busy for anything other than a low, "Hmm? Where? Oh!" He smiled, even as he nipped her earlobe gently with his teeth. If she could finish a sentence, then he clearly wasn't befuddling her as much as he ought. "You were saying?" he murmured, then kissed her deeply on the mouth just to torture her. He lifted his lips off hers just long enough for her to say, "I just—" And then he kissed her again, reeling with pleasure when she groaned with desire. "I'm sorry," he said, scooting his hand under the hem of her dress, and then using them to do all sorts of wicked things to her calves. "You were saying?" "I was?" she asked, her eyes glazed. He moved his hand higher until they were tickling the back of her knee. "You were saying something," he said, pressing his hips against her because he honestly thought he would burst into flame at the very moment if he did not. "I think," he whispered, sliding his hand over the soft skin of her thigh, "that you were going to say you wanted me to touch you here." She gasped, then groaned, then somehow managed to say, "I don't think that's what I was going to say." He grinned against her neck. "You sure?" She nodded. "So then you want me to stop?" She shook her head, frantically. He would take her now, he realized. He would make love to her right here on his mother's sofa, and not only would she let him, she would enjoy herself in every way a woman should. It wouldn't be a conquest. It wouldn't even be a seduction. It would be more than that. Maybe even love. Colin froze. "Colin?" she whispered, opening her eyes. Love? It wasn't possible. Colin? Or maybe it was. Is something wrong? It wasn't that he feared love, or that he didn't believe in it. He just hadn't expected it. He'd always thought love would hit a man like a thunderbolt, that one day he'd be loitering around at some party, bored to tears, and then you'd see a woman, and you'd know instantly that your life would be changed forever. That was what had happened to his brother Benedict, and heaven knew that he and his wife Sophie were blissfully happy rusticating away in the country. But this thing with Penelope, it had crept up on him. The change had been slow, almost lethargic. And if it was love, well, if it was love, wouldn't he know? He watched her closely, curiously, thinking that maybe he'd find his answer in her eyes, or the sweep of her hair, or the way the bodice of her gown hung slightly crookedly. Maybe if he watched her long enough, he'd know. "Colin?" she whispered, starting to sound slightly anxious. He kissed her again, this time with a fierce determination. If this was love, wouldn't it become obvious when they kissed? But if his mind and body were working separately, then the kiss was clearly in a league with his body, because while his mind's confusion remained just as blurry as ever, his body's need was brought into sharper focus. Hell, now he was in pain, and he really couldn't do anything about it here in his mother's drawing room, even if Penelope would have been a willing participant. He pulled back, letting his hand slip down her leg toward the edge of her skirt. "We can't do this here." "I know," she said, sounding so sad that his hand stilled on her knee. He almost lost his resolve to do the right thing and mind the dictates of propriety. He thought hard and fast. It was possible that he could make love to her and no one would walk in on them. Heaven knew that in his current state it would be an embarrassingly fast endeavor anyway. "When is the wedding?" he growled. "A month." "What would it take to change to a fortnight?" She thought about that for a moment. "Bribery or blackmail? Maybe both. Our mothers will not be easily swayed." He groaned, letting his hips sink against hers for one delicious moment before heaving himself off. He couldn't take her now. She was going to be his wife. There would be plenty of time for midday tumbles on illicit sofas, but he owed it to her to use a bed for the first time, at least. "Colin?" she asked, straightening her dress and smoothing her hair. Even though there was no way she was going to make the latter look anything even approaching presentable without a mirror, hairbrush, and maybe even a maid. "Is something wrong?" "I want you," he whispered. She looked up at him, startled. "I just wanted you to know that," he said. "I don't want you to think I stopped because you didn't please me." "Oh." She looked as if she wanted to say something. She looked almost absurdly happy at his words. "Thank you for saying that." He took her hand and squeezed. "Do I look a mess?" she asked. He nodded. "But you're my mess," he whispered, and he was glad for that. End of chapter 15. Burr, 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 burr. Yeah, Erin, literally her calves. I love that Colin's like, "Hey, I might just like fuck her on this couch right now," and then he's like, "No, I can't." And then like meanwhile, there's still like stains from Benedict and Sophie because like I'm 80% sure this is the same drawing room. But yeah, that's the end of reading for the night. We got the Penelope hitting the ground, the "Do you know her?" and "You're my mess" all in one reading. Is this your first time reading it? No, I run a Paul and podcast. That's how obsessed I am. Um, I'd say this is like my fourth-ish time reading it. Yeah, he's grateful that she's his mess. I guess that saves it a little bit, but I think he's silly fucking goose for that one. Without being helpful, he doesn't like reach to like fix her hair a touch to like whatever. Which chapter is the pre-wedding romp sesh? Such a good question. Well, I'm done reading for tonight, so it's not going to be tonight no matter what. Um, chapter 18, I believe. Chapter 17 ends with a stay. It's like, yes, stay. You wouldn't have to ask me 3 times. I'll tell you that for free. I will tell you that for free. You knock it to the 3rd stay, I'll be on the bed. That's just me, though. But yeah. So, not tomorrow. I'm not reading tomorrow. I'm busy tomorrow. Um, what episode do you think they will have their first kiss? Ooh, good question. I mean, I'm hoping Carriage is episode 4, and I hope they kiss before that. So, like, maybe, like, episode 2, episode 3? I don't think episode 1. I think we would be super lucky, and I would love to see it, but I don't think episode 1. He didn't need to ask Penn 3 times. He was just feeling dramatic. 100%. 100%. He's a dramatic king. Like, are you kidding me? Like, do you know her? Like, that was so much drama, and I loved it. I'm calling too. Aaron, I think that's a good guess. I think if they kiss in 2, I'm sorry, I'm chewing with my mouth open. This is my dinner. It's like midnight. I think if they kiss in 2, it's gonna be in the guise of the lessons. So it's gonna be like, oh, Frankie, I know Frankie is your cat, but I forgot your regular name. Hey, Frankie. I think if they kiss in 2, it's gonna be like, well, I don't want to embarrass myself by kissing Lord Devling, so you're gonna have to show me how to kiss. Oh my god, wait, why'd that kind of happen to me in high school? Or like shortly after high school? It was more like, oh my god, I really want to make out with someone right now. That's so embarrassing. Elana. Hey, Elana. Elena, Elana. Give me a. I want him to ask her for the kiss, not the other way around. I'd hate that, honestly. Valid. I don't want her to be like, kiss me. Because, unless, I don't know, I could be fine with it, I guess. But it's not my favorite idea. I mean, I love that for her, though. But it's much different because in the book it was like, I'm gonna be a spinster, like I just want this one thing. And in the show it's like she's actively trying to get married, so her to ask Colin and not reveal her feelings but still ask him, that's a little hard for me to see how they would do that. I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm just saying like I can't see it in my brain, but I'm also not a paid writer. Aaron, good night. Yeah, I'll probably read again on Thursday. So Thursday will be chapter 16 and 17. And then Sunday, maybe it will be 18, which we just established. Everyone wants to read. That's the romp. Y'all should do an episode on book Colin versus show Colin after season 3 is out in full. Elena, you're so smart. Write that down. Rose, are you still here? Rose, write that down. I'm gonna screenshot it. Ugh. Not my finger crevices. I screenshotted it because it's such a good question or such a good suggestion. I think the Kentucky Fried Chicken is making me do the accent. And I think that's the only reason. But yeah, you guys, honestly, I'm about to demolish this chicken bowl. So much love to everyone who joined us. Thank you for being here. I'm going to sign off for the night. I will be reading again probably on Thursday, but I think it's awkward for me to be trying not to smack in y'all's ears. Because you didn't sign up for a mukbang, you signed up for a Bridgerton reading. And I'm done reading. Crystal, you're listening to the podcast. Me and Rose recorded a little bit today, but our energy dwindled there at the end because we record for like 2 hours at a time and then we just like cut it. Depending on how much stuff we have. So we recorded for like 2 hours. Rose listened to it back when I was at work because we have like different hours. And then she's like, hey, our energy really dwindled. So we're gonna re-record a certain part. Um, it'll probably be out later this week or next week. But we were recording today, which is exciting. But yeah, we're gonna re-record on Wednesday, so it'll probably be out by the weekend, depending on our schedules. But I love that you guys are listening. Thank you so much. Much love to the listeners. Um, yeah, and if you guys have thoughts on the episodes, like you can comment right on Spotify. You can send us a DM, whatever you'd like. Stop. You guys make me feel like I'm famous. I'm like, at what point do I call myself a micro influencer? I'm not. And I would not put it on my resume, but a few of my coworkers know I do a podcast, and I'm like, that don't ask any more questions. How lovely for the Irish to release over the weekend. Oh, yeah, it's St. Patty's Day. You have to work. Unfortunately, I have to work on St. Patrick's Day. Maybe I'll do a reading then. Oh, St. Patrick's Day would be. Well, okay, here's the thing. So, do you guys want me to just wait and not do the reading on actual St. Patrick's Day if you're gonna be like out and about? Or because that's gonna be the post like engagement ball escapades. So, I don't know if people are gonna miss it because they have more of a life than I do. Because I was gonna read on Sunday. So, y'all can leave opinions. Do the day before. I cannot do the day before. I work all night, unfortunately. But I feel like the day before is Saturday, and that's when most people would go out to celebrate. So I feel like it, even though it is like the actual holiday, I feel like doing Sunday. Let me check my work schedule. Hold on. I don't know what I'm doing. I guess I could do Monday. Y'all got plans on Sunday? Like you're busy? Because yeah, I guess I could do Monday. I'm off Monday. Okay, Crystal Slay. I love that you're off Monday. I'm also off Monday. So maybe we can hang out. Um, yeah. So I guess I'll save it till Monday then. Maybe I'll go out. Maybe I'll have a drink. Be crazy. Be crazy. Not sit in my room and read books to strangers online. Because I'm like, Crystal, it's your birthday coming up? Ooh, happy birthday. Um, yeah. Okay, I'll read. I'll schedule it so you can just check the profile later because I have to do some math. I'll probably read on Thursday, and then the next one after that will be Monday. So Monday the 8th. Oh my god, that makes sense. Okay, so the 18th, Monday the 18th will be chapter 18, which is like the porn one. So if y'all are here for to watch me fight my way through a horny chapter, come back on the 18th. Absolutely fighting for my life. All right, I'm going to demolish this. I'll talk to you guys later. I think they'll be launching the season 2 rewatch on Sunday too. Ooh. We'll keep an eye on that. We will keep a peeper on that. Um, But honestly, this is like a pollen podcast, so I don't know how much we'll touch on. But I love that people are getting their Bridgerton content in some way or another, but I don't know how much we'll touch on the season 2 rewatch. But I love to know that it's happening. Thank you, Alyssa. Okay, I'm gonna leave. I love you guys so much. Thank you for joining me. It's been real. I will see you on Thursday. Bye.